I Want to Be a Real Number, Part 2, Simplify Imaginary Numbers. I was always told by his parents that real numbers would never accept him, so they never visited. When I was a teenager, he decided he wanted to find out for himself. I had heard of a radical house party and all of the numbers would be there. The problem was, no negative numbers were invited. He thought because no one had ever met him before, that maybe he could sneak in. Unfortunately, every number he tried talking to tried to throw him out, saying he did not belong. So I just sat outside the radical party looking through the window, wishing he could be a real number too. Now let's see how I's situation relates to imaginary numbers. Today we're going to simplify and write imaginary numbers. Let's take this example, the square root of negative 16. First, we have to write it as a product of the square root of negative 1 and 16, which is the number under the radical. Second, we're going to write the square root of negative 1 as I and simplify the square root of 16. The square root of 16 is 4. Finally, we're going to write it in the form of bi. For this problem, the square root of negative 16, the answer is 4i. This is now in imaginary form. Let's look at a second example, the square root of negative 50. First, we have to separate the square root of 50 times the square root of negative 1. Remember that the square root of negative 1 simplifies to I, and the square root of 50 simplifies to 25 times 2. 25 is a perfect square and can be written as 5 times the square root of 2, and we have times I. The last step is to write it in imaginary form, so we end up with 5i times the square root of 2. Our final example today is the square root of negative 45 over 81. First, we have to write it as a quotient of two radicals, the square root of negative 45 over the square root of 81. Second, we have to simplify the numerator and the denominator. The numerator simplifies to the square root of 45 times negative 1 divided by the square root of 81. 45 can be broken up into 9 times 5, and the square root of 81 is 9. Finally, we have to write it in imaginary form. 9 is a perfect square, so it can be brought out of the radical as 3, and negative 1 can be written as I. So we have 3i times the square root of 5 over 9. We now must simplify between the numerator and denominator. 3 and 9 have a common factor of 3, so our final answer is simplified to I times the square root of 5 divided by 3. In conclusion, in order to simplify radicals and write them in imaginary form, we first must separate out the square root of negative 1 and write it as I. We then must simplify the number under the radical, and finally we have to write it in imaginary form of bi. I hope this video helped you to understand how to simplify radicals with a negative number and write them in imaginary form. If you'd like to continue the story, I Want to Be a Real Number, please continue with Part 3.